Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, I had school. Thursday, I had primary, as I said earlier. When I got a little bit older, Wednesday, I would also be there all day too, basically. I'd be there for school in the morning. In the evening, when I was like in middle school, I started going to girls' class.
By the time Leon became an adult, something had fundamentally changed. They were no longer simply the child viewers remembered from Sister Wives. They were no longer living entirely within the rules, expectations, and belief system they had been taught as a child. Leon had reached the point where they could finally look at their upbringing from the outside, and that is where childhood memories can become very complicated. Because sometimes you don't fully understand what you experienced until you're old enough to question it. And for Leon, that process appears to have involved questioning some of the beliefs and expectations they were raised around. When you're a child, questioning your parents can feel almost impossible. Your parents are your authority. They're the people who explain the world to you. They're the people who tell you what is right and wrong. And when religion is deeply connected to family life, those beliefs can become even more powerful. But adulthood changes the equation. Suddenly, you can research things yourself. You can meet people outside your community. You can listen to different perspectives. You can make decisions without asking your parents for permission. And perhaps most importantly, you can say, I don't think I believe that anymore. That can be incredibly liberating, but it can also be painful. Because changing your beliefs doesn't necessarily mean you stop loving the people who taught them to you. It's tempting for people watching a reality show to describe an adult child as simply rebelling. But that's often an oversimplification. Leon wasn't just making random decisions to upset their family. They were developing an identity, and identity is something every person eventually has to figure out. The difference is that most people get to do it privately. Leon has had to do it publicly. Their family is famous. Their childhood was televised. Their parents' relationship became a major television storyline, and their own life eventually became part of that public conversation. That means every step Leon takes away from the expectations of their childhood can become a topic of discussion. Imagine trying to figure out who you are while knowing thousands or even millions of strangers already have an opinion about who you should be. That's a completely different kind of pressure. One reason Leon's adult perspective has become so interesting is that the Brown family's world has changed dramatically. When the series began, plural marriage was the central identity of the family. Kody had multiple wives. The children were being raised within that structure, and the family repeatedly tried to explain why their lifestyle worked for them. But years later, the structure looks completely different. Christine left. Janelle moved on. Mary eventually separated from Kody, and the family that once presented itself as one enormous plural household became increasingly divided into separate lives. That changes how viewers interpret the past. Things that seem normal at the beginning of the show can look very different when you know how the story eventually unfolded. And Leon grew up during that transformation. Think about what that must mean from a child's perspective. For years, you're told that your family structure is important. You're told that this is how your family works. You're taught to believe in a particular future. And then you watch the adults around you change their minds. Relationships end. Family members move away. Old rules become less important. And suddenly the structure you grew up believing was permanent isn't permanent anymore. That can force a person to rethink everything, not necessarily because someone told them to, but because life itself gave them new information. And this may be one reason Leon's adult perspective is so different from the perspective they had as a child. One of the biggest differences between childhood and adulthood is choice. As a child, you inherit your family. As an adult, you begin building your own. That's what Leon has done. They've created a life that reflects their own identity rather than simply repeating the life they were raised around. And that is important because the Brown family story has always involved adults making unconventional choices, but eventually the children get to make unconventional choices too. That's the natural consequence of raising independent human beings. You can teach your children your values, you can explain your beliefs, you can hope they'll follow your path. But eventually, they're going to choose their own, and sometimes those choices will look nothing like what you expected. When Leon describes their upbringing using such strong language, fans aren't just hearing an opinion about religion, they're hearing an adult reflecting on childhood, and those are two different things. Leon isn't describing the Brown family's beliefs from the perspective of someone watching the show for entertainment. They're describing the environment they personally grew up inside. That's why their comments carry emotional weight. At the same time, viewers should avoid turning Leon's personal experience into a universal statement about every member of the Brown family. One person's experience doesn't automatically explain everyone's experience, but it does deserve to be taken seriously. And that's exactly where the conversation becomes more interesting than simple fan arguments. Of course, whenever Leon talks about their childhood, viewers inevitably bring Kody into the conversation. Kody was the central authority figure in the Brown family. He established many of the family's expectations. And because Sister Wives revolves so heavily around Kody's relationships and decisions, viewers naturally want to know how those decisions affected the children. But Leon's story shouldn't be reduced to whether they blame Kody. The bigger issue is how a parent's choices shape a child's understanding of the world. Every parent does this. But in the Brown family, those choices were unusually visible. The family structure was controversial, the religious beliefs were unconventional, and the entire process was filmed. So the consequences were being documented in real time. And then there's Mary. Leon is marrying Kody's child, which means their childhood was also deeply connected to the complicated relationship between those two adults. Fans watched Mary struggle with her position within the family. They watched the relationship between Mary and Kody deteriorate, and eventually they watched Mary move forward with her own life. Leon grew up while all of this was happening. Again, we shouldn't assume that every family conflict affected Leon in one specific way, but it's reasonable to recognize that children notice instability. They notice tension, they notice when relationships change, and they remember how those changes made them feel. That's another reason adult reflection can be so powerful. A child remembers events. An adult can finally understand them. Leon's description of their upbringing as a cult also forces viewers to look at the difference between religion as an institution and religion as a personal experience. For the Brown family, faith was deeply connected to their family structure, but Leon's later perspective shows that inherited beliefs aren't necessarily permanent. People can leave religious systems. They can reinterpret them, they can reject certain teachings while keeping others, they can create completely different spiritual or philosophical identities, and none of that happens overnight. It's usually a process. Sometimes it takes years, sometimes it involves painful conversations, sometimes it changes relationships, and sometimes it gives a person a sense of freedom they didn't know they were missing. This may be the most important point of all. Leon didn't choose their childhood. They didn't choose their parents. They didn't choose the religious environment. They didn't choose to become part of a famous reality TV family. But as an adult, they can choose what happens next. That's the distinction between being raised inside a system and eventually becoming independent from it. Your childhood can influence you. It can shape you. It can hurt you. It can give you positive memories. It can give you complicated memories. But it doesn't have to control your entire future. And Leon's adult life is evidence of that. At this point, fans are left with a much bigger question than, was the Brown family's religion a cult? The more meaningful question may actually be, what did Leon need to become the person they wanted to be? Because that's the part of the story that isn't really about Kody, it's not really about Mary, and it's not even primarily about Sister Wives. It's about Leon. A person who grew up inside a very public family, struggled with being shy and fearful, and eventually became an adult capable of looking back at that environment and deciding what it meant to them. And that transformation is powerful. There's something else that makes Leon's journey particularly significant. When a child grows up with strong expectations about how they're supposed to live, breaking away can sometimes create a painful conflict between who your family expects you to be and who you know yourself to be. And that conflict can affect everything: relationships, family connections, faith, identity, and the way you see your own childhood. Leon has had to navigate those questions publicly, and the Brown family has had to navigate them too. So the real story isn't simply about someone leaving an old belief system behind. It's about what happens to a family when one generation begins questioning the assumptions of the generation before it. And that is where the Brown family story becomes much bigger than reality television. Because Leon's journey may represent something many adult children experience, you can respect where you came from without allowing it to decide where you're going. And in part 4, we're going to look at the bigger picture, how Leon's comments fit into the Brown family's transformation, why fans are revisiting old Sister Wives moments and what this could mean for the family's future relationship with Leon. Because after everything this family has been through, the question isn't simply whether they can agree.
Talking to strangers in public.
The real question is, can they understand each other? After everything we've discussed so far, one thing has become clear. Leon's story isn't simply about looking back at childhood. It's about what happens when someone grows up, develops their own identity, and finally gains enough distance to look at their past through adult eyes. And that's why Leon's comments have hit Sister Wives fans so differently, because for years, viewers were watching the Brown family from the outside. We saw what the cameras showed us. We heard the adults explain their beliefs. We watched the family defend their choices. But the children were living inside that world, and now those children are adults. They can speak for themselves. Think about the Brown family we met when Sister Wives began. Kody was at the center. Mary, Janelle, Christine, and Robin were part of one plural family. The children were younger. The family was trying to convince viewers that their unconventional lifestyle could work. There were disagreements, of course. There were jealousies. There were emotional moments. But underneath all of it was the idea that this family structure was supposed to continue. Years later, that vision has changed dramatically. Mary and Kody are no longer together. Christine left and built a new life. Janelle also moved forward independently. The children have grown up, and many of them have developed lives and beliefs that are distinctly their own. So when Leon now talks about their upbringing, fans aren't hearing from the same child they remember from the early seasons. They're hearing from an adult who has lived through the collapse of the family structure they grew up inside. This is one of the strangest things about reality television. The footage never grows up. The people do. A scene filmed years ago can suddenly look completely different after you learn what happened later. A conversation that once seemed harmless can feel more significant. A family argument can take on a different meaning. A child's reaction can suddenly stand out. And viewers start going back, they rewatch, they search old episodes, they compare what people said then with what they say now. That's exactly what happens whenever a former reality TV child begins talking openly about their upbringing. People start asking, did we miss something? But here's the important distinction. Rewatching old footage can raise questions. It cannot automatically prove what someone was feeling privately. Only the person who lived it can explain that. And that's why Leon's own words matter more than fan theories. Another important point is that families are complicated. Two siblings can grow up in the same house and remember it completely differently. One child may remember family traditions fondly. Another may remember the same traditions as stressful. One may feel connected to the family's religion. Another may eventually reject it. One may want to stay close to the family. Another may need more distance. That doesn't automatically mean one person is lying. It means people experience life differently. So Leon describing their childhood in strong terms doesn't mean every Brown child has to describe their childhood the same way. And it doesn't mean viewers should decide how the other children feel. Their stories belong to them. For years, Leon was primarily known to the public as one of Kody and Mary's children, but adulthood changed that. Leon became an individual separate from the family television storyline. Their identity became their own. Their relationships became their own. Their choices became their own. Their choices became their own. And their understanding of their childhood became their own. That's a major transition for anyone. But it's especially significant when your family has spent years being publicly discussed. Because eventually you have to decide, do I keep living according to the story other people wrote about me, or do I write my own? Leon appears to have chosen the second option. And this isn't happening in isolation. The entire Brown family has been forced to adapt. The plural marriage that once defined the series has largely disappeared from the family's current reality. The wives have gone in different directions. The children have become adults. Some family relationships have become stronger. Others have become strained. And the family that once seemed inseparable has become a collection of individuals trying to figure out how to relate to one another. That creates a completely different family dynamic. There is no longer one simple structure everyone has to fit into. Everyone gets to decide what their relationship looks like. And that can be both freeing and painful. This is where we need to be careful. We shouldn't claim that Leon has completely cut off every member of the Brown family unless Leon has explicitly said so. We also shouldn't assume that describing a difficult childhood means someone wants nothing to do with their parents. Family relationships don't work that simply. Someone can criticize their upbringing and still love a parent. Someone can establish boundaries and still care deeply. Someone can disagree with their family's beliefs without rejecting every person in the family, and someone can need distance without wanting permanent
Monday,
separation.
Tuesday, Wednesday
Those
for
distinctions
school.
matter, especially in
And
a
then
family
on
as
Thursday,
complicated
we
as this
had
one.
primary,
Naturally,
which is like-
fans are going to wonder what Leon's reflections mean for their relationship with Kody. Kody has been one of the most controversial figures in the Sister Wives universe. Over the years, his relationships with several of his children have become sources of public discussion. But Leon's perspective should still be allowed to stand on its own. The question isn't simply,
Religious
is Leon Team
education
Kody or
of children.
Team everyone else?
Or religious
Families aren't sports teams. The
Yeah,
real
I love
question
sports.
is whether people can eventually understand each other's experiences. And sometimes that requires admitting that two people remember the same family completely differently. Then there is Mary. Mary has experienced enormous changes in her own life. She went from being Kody's first
And
wife to
I will
eventually
talk
moving
about how
forward
this step has
independently.
impacted me.
And because
I
Leon
will
is
not
her
talk about
child, fans naturally wonder how Mary responds when Leon discusses their childhood. But again, we shouldn't put words in Mary's mouth. Unless she directly addresses a particular statement, anything beyond that is speculation. What we can say is that parent-child relationships can survive complicated
You know what I mean?
histories.
Like,
They can evolve. They can become more honest. And sometimes adulthood allows parents and children to communicate in ways that weren't possible when the child was younger. This is perhaps the biggest takeaway. Leon's story isn't interesting only because they're connected to a famous reality TV family. It's interesting because their experience raises a universal question. What happens when adults begin questioning the world they were raised in? That happens in religious families. It happens in traditional families. It happens in conservative families. It happens in progressive families. It happens everywhere. Children grow up. They encounter new ideas, they develop their own identities, and eventually they have to decide what they believe. Sometimes they follow their parents, sometimes they don't. Sometimes they keep some traditions and reject others. That's part of becoming an adult. This is something Sister Wives fans should probably pay more attention to. The original show was built around the adults, but now the children are adults too. They have careers, relationships, families, beliefs, boundaries, and opinions about the world they grew up in. That means the future of the Brown family story may not actually belong to Kody. It may belong to the next generation because they are the ones who can tell viewers what it was like to grow up inside this family, and they can decide whether they even want to continue telling that story. Maybe that's why the word cult has created such a strong reaction. Some fans hear it and immediately agree. Others reject the description. But underneath the argument is something much more important. Leon is describing their own experience, and you don't have to agree with every interpretation to recognize that a person has the right to describe how their childhood felt to them. That's where the conversation should begin. Not with attacking Leon, not with attacking every member of the Brown family, but with listening. So after everything we've discussed, what should fans take away from Leon's story? Not that every detail of the Brown family's past has suddenly been explained. Not that every family member shares the same experience. And not that one statement gives us the complete truth about a complicated childhood. Instead, the bigger lesson is this: reality television only shows us part of a family. The cameras can capture arguments. They can capture celebrations, they can capture conversations, but they can't capture every thought inside a child's head. They can't show every private emotion, and they certainly can't tell us how someone will interpret those experiences 20 years later. Leon can, because Leon lived it. And now, as an adult, they have the ability to tell their story from their own perspective. That is why their voice matters. The Brown family story has already gone through marriages, separations, family conflicts, religious disagreements, and years of public scrutiny. But perhaps the most interesting chapter is the one happening now. The children are adults. They're no longer simply characters in their parents' story. They're becoming storytellers themselves. And when they speak about the past, fans have to decide whether they're going to listen or simply argue about which parent they think is right. Because Leon's story isn't really asking us to choose a side. It's asking us to understand that childhood can look completely different from the inside. And maybe that's the part of the Sister Wives story viewers never truly saw. A family can look united on television while every person inside it is experiencing that family in a completely different way. And for Leon, adulthood has finally given them the freedom to explain what that childhood meant to them. If this story has taught us anything, it's that the Brown family's most important chapters may no longer be about the adults who started the show. They may be about the children who grew up watching it happen. And now those children have voices of their own. After everything we've talked about, there is one thing we can probably agree on. Leon Brown's story is much bigger than one shocking word. Yes, the word cult immediately grabbed everyone's attention. Yes, describing a childhood as fearful or difficult naturally makes people want answers. And yes, Sister Wives fans are going to have strong opinions about what Leon said. But if we focus only on the most controversial phrase, we miss the real story. The real story is about a child who grew up inside a very unusual family structure, surrounded by strong religious beliefs, family expectations, and cameras, and eventually became an adult who had to decide what those experiences meant to them. For years, viewers knew Leon primarily through the Brown family. We watched them grow up. We watched their relationship with their parents. We watched major family events. And eventually, we watched Leon become an adult. But there is an important difference between watching someone grow up and actually knowing what they experienced. The audience saw the television version. Leon lived the real life. Those are not necessarily the same thing. And now that Leon is an adult, they have the freedom to look backward and say, this is how I experienced it. That doesn't require every fan to agree. It doesn't require every member of the Brown family to agree. But it does deserve to be heard. One thing reality television makes especially complicated is the fact that childhood memories can become permanent entertainment. Most people grow up, make mistakes, change, and eventually leave their childhood behind. Reality TV children don't always get that luxury. Their childhood can remain online forever. Old conversations can be replayed. Old arguments can be analyzed. Old photographs can resurface. And strangers can develop opinions about experiences they never personally witnessed. Leon has had to navigate that reality. And that's why their perspective today is so different. They're not simply remembering childhood. They're trying to understand it. The controversy surrounding Leon's wording may eventually disappear. Another headline will replace it. Another Sister Wives storyline will come along. But the deeper questions will remain. What does it mean to grow up in a highly structured religious environment? What happens when the beliefs you inherited no longer feel right? What happens when your family's expectations conflict with your identity? And what happens when all of those struggles happen while cameras are watching? Those questions are much bigger than Sister Wives, and they're much bigger than one family. The family that viewers met years ago simply doesn't exist in the same form anymore. The relationships changed, the marriages changed, the children grew up, and the adults changed too. That's life. Families evolve. Sometimes people grow together. Sometimes they grow apart. Sometimes relationships become stronger after difficult periods. Sometimes boundaries become necessary. And sometimes people discover that loving someone doesn't require agreeing with them. That's an especially important lesson for the Brown family, because their future can't be based on recreating the family structure of the past. That chapter is already different. The question now is what kind of relationships they can build going forward. This is where fans need to resist the temptation to create a storyline that hasn't been confirmed. We shouldn't assume exactly how Leon feels about every member of the Brown family today. We shouldn't assume that criticism means permanent estrangement. And we shouldn't assume that difficult childhood memories automatically erase the good ones. Real relationships are complicated. Leon can have difficult feelings about the past while still caring about certain family members. They can disagree with their upbringing without rejecting every person who was part of it. And they can create boundaries without explaining every detail to the public. That's their choice. Kody's legacy on Sister Wives has always been debated. Viewers have their opinions. His former wives have their experiences, and his children have their own perspectives. That last part is especially important because eventually the people who are raised inside the family become adults. They can decide what kind of relationship they want with their parents. They can decide which lessons they want to carry forward, and they can decide which parts of their childhood they want to leave behind. For Kody, that means his relationship with his adult children may ultimately matter more than what viewers think of him, because those relationships are real. They aren't edited into a television episode. Mary has also gone through an enormous transformation. For years, viewers watched her struggle with her place in the family. Eventually, she began building a life outside of her relationship with Kody. And that gives us another example of something we've seen repeatedly throughout the Brown family story. People change, Mary changed, Christine changed, Janelle changed, the children changed, and Leon changed. Maybe that's the real story of sister wives, not simply plural marriage, not simply Kody. But what happens when people who built their identities around one family structure eventually realize they are allowed to become individuals? This may be the most important message of the entire story. A difficult childhood doesn't have to become a permanent identity. A complicated family doesn't have to determine your future. And questioning your upbringing doesn't mean you're doomed to repeat it. People can break patterns. They can establish boundaries. They can find communities that make them feel comfortable. They can decide what family means to them. And they can create a life that reflects who they are now, not simply who they were expected to be as children. That's what makes Leon's journey worth watching. And this is something the reality TV industry needs to think about too. When children appear on television, audiences often remember them as children, but those children eventually become adults. They develop opinions about what happened. They may agree with the way their childhood was portrayed, or they may disagree. They may be proud of certain moments. They may regret others. And they may eventually decide they want to tell their own version of the story. That's what makes Leon's perspective so significant. It's not simply another sister wives storyline. It's part of a larger conversation about what happens when reality TV children become adults and finally get control over their own narratives. Maybe we don't need to decide whether Leon's description is right or wrong. Maybe we should start somewhere simpler. Listen to what Leon is actually saying. Don't add accusations they didn't make. Don't invent experiences they haven't described. Don't turn their story into a weapon against another family member. And don't dismiss their feelings simply because you remember the television show differently. Two things can be true at the same time. The Brown family can have had genuine love and meaningful memories. And Leon can still look back at parts of their upbringing negatively. That's the complexity of family. For years, the Brown family story was mostly told by the adults. Now the children are adults too, and they have their own stories. Leon has already shown that they are willing to speak about their past in their own language. Whether every fan agrees with those words is almost beside the point. What matters is that Leon no longer has to be defined exclusively by the version of them we saw growing up on television. They get to define themselves. They get to decide what their past means. And most importantly, they get to decide what their future looks like. So perhaps the biggest question isn't, was the Brown family really a cult? That's a debate that will probably continue among fans. The more important question is,
this is like weird because
can this family learn to respect the different ways its members experience the same childhood? Because that is where healing or continued conflict could begin. The Brown children don't have to remember everything the same way. They don't have to believe the same things. They don't have to live the same lifestyle. They don't even have to have identical relationships with their parents. They're individuals. And perhaps that's something the Brown family has been learning all along. When Sister Wives first premiered, the audience was introduced to a family trying to prove that their unconventional lifestyle could work. Years later, the story has become something very different. It's now about people leaving relationships, finding independence, questioning beliefs, creating new identities, and children who have grown up enough to look back and decide what their childhood means to them. Leon's story reminds us that behind every reality TV family is something the cameras can never completely capture, a private emotional life. We can watch the episodes, we can analyze the arguments, we can debate the parents, we can discuss the marriages, but ultimately only the people who lived those experiences know exactly what they felt. And Leon has now given fans another perspective to consider. Not necessarily the final answer, not the complete story, but their story. And maybe that's the most important thing, because you can come from a complicated past without being trapped by it. You can question what you were taught. You can become someone your younger self never imagined, and you can build a future that belongs entirely to you. So what do you think about Leon's comments? Do you think their adult perspective changes the way you see the Brown family's early years? Or do you think viewers should separate Leon's personal experience from the family's overall story? Let me know in the comments. And if you enjoy Sister Wives updates, family drama, behind-the-scenes discussions, and the receipts that don't always make it onto television, make sure you subscribe to Drama and Receipts, because the Brown family story may have changed, but the receipts are still coming. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.